I wanted to mention another, the issue of Terach, which you notice. So the issue of the journey to Canaan by Abraham's family is used as a classic argument in support of the documentary hypothesis. Because we're told in Genesis 11, in verse 27 through 32, that Terach, the father, had sons, including Abraham, and that Terach, left Ur for Canaan, but that when they reached Haran, they settled there. And then he died in Haran. Then, in the following chapter, in Genesis 12, verse 1, we're told that God told Abraham to leave his homeland, his people, his father's house, and go to Canaan. Okay? So clearly, these stories seem to contradict one another. Okay? If we take Genesis 11 seriously, then Abraham was no longer in his homeland or with his people. He had left Ur with his father and was now in Haran. Okay? So the documentary hypothesists solve this problem easily. If there are two clashing stories, this means that there were two clashing Israelite oral history traditions, and the editor simply mashed them up together, back to back. One tradition had the family leaving Ur for Canaan, for whatever reason. The father never finished the journey, but his son did. Okay, they stopped in Haran, the father died, and then the son continued. The second tradition attributes the journey to God's command to Abraham. Okay, so it's not that Terach went to Canaan, it's Abraham. And this tradition claims that Haran, rather than Ur, was Abraham's homeland. Okay, so the documentary hypothesists suggest that the readers at the time either didn't notice the discrepancy, or that they didn't care. Okay, they picked up the story that matched their oral history tradition. The documentary hypothesis assumes that the biblical editor was careless and that the Bible's readers were likewise careless or not perceptive. But if we start with the opposite assumption about the author and about the readers, the original audience, so if we take a look at the text for answers, we can see that the text can solve the purported contradiction for us. Okay? It's true that Genesis 11 ends with Terach resettling or settling in Haran and dying there. And then Genesis 12 starts with God telling Abraham to leave his homeland for Canaan. So if the Torah were a chronological history book, this really would suggest that Abraham's journey started after his father's death. Okay? But we know from other parts of the Torah that the story is not told chronologically. Okay? The Torah is a series of biographies tracing a character from birth to death before moving on to the next story. Okay? So if you do the math based on what age characters in the story died, you'll see that Noah died when Abraham was 58 years old, even though Noah dies in Genesis 9, 2 chapters before Abraham is even born, in chapter 11. Likewise, Isaac dies in Genesis 35, even though the math tells us that he was still alive 2 chapters later when Joseph was sold to the Ishmaelites. Okay? So again, the Torah doesn't tell you the story chronologically, it tells you full biographies from birth to death. Okay? So this narrative style allows the apparent contradiction in the Terach and Abraham stories to be resolved without the intervention of a clumsy editor of the documentary hypothesis. Okay, if you look at the math that the text tells you, and take it seriously, the text tells us that Terach was 70 years old when he had Abraham. We're told that Abraham was 75 when he left Haran. And we're told that Terach died at 250 years old. Okay? So the math solves the problems for us. The math tells us that Terach was only 145 years old when Abraham left him. He still had 105 years of life ahead of him. Okay? So clearly this illustrates that the story is not told chronologically. Terach's death at the end of chapter 11 actually took place 105 years after God spoke to Abraham the first time, at the beginning of the next chapter of Genesis 12. Okay? So now that now that we're liberated from that sequential sequence, from the assumption that the Torah tells us a sequence of events, once you're no longer approaching the text this way, now you have a text that makes complete sense without relying on a clumsy editor and careless readers. God speaks to Abraham in Ur. The whole clan, including Terach, departs with Abraham. But when they reach Haran, which was, again, this commercial and cultural center, the whole clan settles and prospers there. Whereas Abraham continues his own journey to his promised land, Canaan, leaving not only his homeland, but also his people and his father's house. So for next week, please read Genesis 20 through 23. Actually, Genesis 20 through 23, but also read 24 verse 1. Okay, that's where you should end. 20 through 24 verse 1. And again, as you do, consider whether you consider Abraham to be devout. Okay, you probably already know that Abraham is renowned for his faith in God. And just consider whether you think that this reputation is justified. Also, I want to clarify, as an aside, something with regard to Eliezer and Hagar, who are described as slaves. So, slavery in the Bible is not the kind of chattel slavery that we recognize from early American history. Okay? Biblical slavery was either what we call indentured servitude, by which someone voluntarily sells himself into slavery for a period of time to pay off a debt or to become a member of somebody's household and therefore be fed and housed and clothed. Okay, so it's an exchange of your labor for money that you owe or money that or goods and services that you receive from this person. So that's one form of slavery in the Bible. Another is a form of taxation. Okay? And this was probably the kind of slavery that we're talking about in Egypt. It's a system by which people owed a tax to their local ruler, and they paid the tax with their labor. Okay? X number of days per week or per month. So ancient slavery was indeed a system of forced labor, but it was not the kind of slavery that we associate with the New World, a system by which a person is the legal property of another and whose children are born into slavery. Okay? For example, Abraham and Jacob had multiple children from their wives, slave women, Hagar being one of them, and all of these children were born free and were full members of the family. Okay? Of the 12 children, of the 12 sons that Jacob had, I think at least, I think 4, maybe 5, were sons of these handmaidens or slave women, or whatever translation we use. And yet there were full-fledged sons who inherited Jacob's property and his name alongside the sons of the real wives, Leah and Rachel. Okay? So slaves in the Bible were members of the household, but they were brought into the family not by marriage or procreation, but by purchase. Okay. By the same token, we know from the text we read last week that Abraham's servant or slave Eliezer stood to inherit Abraham until Ishmael and Isaac were born. Okay, when Abraham thought that he would die childless, he understood, it was understood, that his slave or his servant, this person Eliezer, would inherit Abraham's possessions. Okay? So unless you're talking about slavery as a labor tax system like in Egypt, a slave was a member of the household, lower status certainly, but a member of the household nonetheless, and in the line of inheritance, and whose children were a part of the family. Also, to further add to the confusion, the term slave and servant are synonymous and interchangeable in the Bible. So Moses is referred to as a slave of God, as is Joshua, not because they're forced to serve God, but because they are servants of God. Likewise, in the New Testament, the original ancient Greek regularly and ubiquitously refers to Christians as slaves of God or of Christ. Okay. Some modern translations preserve that word, but the English translations usually do not. Okay, and that's these translations are where you'll see the Greek term for slave, which is doulos, replaced with servant. So even though the Greek text says slave, the translator, based on the context, translates it into servant. Okay, so again, whether in the Old Testament or the New Testament. Also, when Samuel warns the Samuel the prophet warns the Israelites against instituting a monarchy in the book of Samuel, he warns them that a king would take their fields and vineyards and give them to his slaves. And again, the translators into English render this as servants. Okay, so my point is to show that clearly the king taking your fields and vineyards and giving them to his slaves, these are clearly not slaves as we in the 21st century understand slavery. Okay, when Samuel talks about the king giving this stolen property to his slaves, he means his entourage, his crew, his ministers, his subordinates. Likewise, David's soldiers are referred to as his slaves when they're clearly not slaves. Okay, they are not his property, but his subordinates, or even his mercenaries. We know for a fact that they were not David's property because these soldiers are referred to also as the slaves of Yoav, which is David's top general. Okay. In the book of Exodus, too, repeatedly and consistently, there's references to Pharaoh's ministers and advisors and his soldiers as his slaves. Okay, these characters are clearly not slaves in the same sense that the Israelites are slaves. Okay, the Israelites are forced laborers, where these other people who are described as slaves are servants or employees or subordinates, including aristocrats. Okay, priests and ministers who are described as slaves. Okay, so a slave in the Bible could be a subordinate serving his superior, his employer, his patron, his general, his king, or his god. Or a slave in the Bible could be a real slave, meaning somebody who performs forced labor, like the slaves in Egypt. Or a slave could be a person purchased with money and now is subject to his master's authority, like Hagar and Eliezer, and who are Sarah's slave woman and Abraham's slave, or servant, or again. So these slaves were not property, but lower status members of the master's household, as either servants or laborers or concubines. Okay? And even today, in modern Hebrew, when Israelis say the phrase, I am your humble servant, what they're saying in Hebrew is, I am your loyal slave. Ani avdecha hane'eman. Okay, that's just the way, if you want to say, I'm your humble servant, that's what you're saying. I'm your loyal slave. Okay? So this fluidity in the meaning of slave, the biblical word slave, is reflected in translation practices. Many English translations translate the Hebrew word slave into servant, or subordinate, or subject, or minister, depending on the context, because it would be misleading to English readers to describe David's soldiers as slaves, or Moses as a slave of God, or the Egyptian ministers as, David's generals as slaves. Okay, so the translator changes the word so as not to confuse us, even though simply because the Hebrew word dogs. The Hebrew word has this range of applications. Historians of American slavery, people like Ira Berlin, warn us not to project our 19th century image of slavery, the image that we have from the mature plantation system in the American South, onto slavery in the 17th century colonies. Okay? And not to project that plantation system of slavery on frontier slavery in frontier regions in early America. Okay? So he points out that the plantation system was of a certain time and place, and other locations and other times, slavery operated differently. Okay? So we shouldn't project the later form of slavery on the earlier forms and settings. We should heed this advice even more strictly when reading and imagining slavery in the ancient Near East. Okay, so I'll see you next week, and we'll finish the Abraham story.